The morning mist clung to the grounds of Greenways Manor like a shroud, reluctant to yield to the pale April sun that struggled through the ancient oaks lining the estate. It was the sort of morning that might have graced a watercolor painting, serene, timeless, and utterly English in its quiet beauty. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room of her cottage in St. Mary Mead, was engaged in the pleasant task of sorting through correspondence when her nephew Raymond's wife, Joan, arrived with news that would shatter the village's peaceful routine. "Aunt Jane," Joan burst through the door, her usually composed face flushed with excitement and horror. "The most dreadful thing has happened at Greenways Manor. Simply dreadful." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, and her keen blue eyes observing the younger woman's agitation with interest. "Do sit down, my dear. You look quite overwrought." Joan collapsed into the chair opposite, her handbag sliding from her lap unnoticed. "It's the Ashworth family, or rather, what's left of them. 4 of them dead, Aunt Jane. 4, all in one night." "Dear me," Miss Marple murmured, her knitting needles already in her hands. The rhythmic click-click-click a counterpoint to Joan's breathless account. "How very distressing. The Ashworths of Greenways Manor, you say?" "Yes, you know them, surely. Colonel Edmund Ashworth, retired from India 3 years ago. He bought Greenways from the Fortescue estate when old Mrs. Fortescue died. There's his wife, Lydia, and his 2 children from his first marriage, Gerald and Millicent. Were, I should say. They're all dead now." Except, Miss Marple prompted gently. "Except the governess, Miss Pemberton, Clara Pemberton. She's the one who discovered them this morning." Joan leaned forward, lowering her voice, though they were quite alone. "They're saying it was some sort of poisoning. All 4 of them, taken ill after dinner last night. The doctor was called, but by morning it was too late." Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. "And Miss Pemberton was unaffected. She didn't dine with the family. Apparently she'd been suffering from a headache and took her meal in her room, just tea and toast brought up by the maid. The only reason she's alive, according to Mrs. Hartnell, who heard it from her sister, who's friendly with the Greenways cook." The village grapevine, Miss Marple reflected. It was as efficient as any modern communication system. More so, perhaps, given its remarkable speed and the embellishments that inevitably accompanied each retelling. 4 deaths from poisoning, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. That does seem rather extensive. One might almost say thorough. The police have been there since dawn. Inspector Craddock himself came down from the county seat. They've questioned everyone in the household, the servants, the governess, even the gardener who was working late yesterday evening. "And what do they suspect?" Joan hesitated, then whispered the words that had clearly been burning on her tongue. "They think it might be Miss Pemberton. She's the only one who could have done it, isn't she? The only one who survived." Miss Marple said nothing for a moment, her needles never faltering. She was thinking of her parlour maid, Emily, who had once been accused of theft simply because she was the last person in the room where money had gone missing. Emily had been innocent, of course. The real thief had been the mistress of the house, who had staged the entire incident to cover her gambling debts. "I shouldn't like to jump to conclusions," Miss Marple said mildly. "Though I suppose it does seem rather convenient, doesn't it? Rather too convenient, perhaps." By midday, the entire village of St. Mary Mead had learned of the tragedy at Greenways Manor. Miss Marple, who had planned a quiet afternoon of gardening, found herself instead receiving a steady stream of visitors, each bearing their own version of events and theories about the crime. Mrs. Hartnell arrived first, her ample bosom heaving with the exertion of hurrying up the garden path. "Such a scandal, Miss Marple. Such a dreadful, dreadful scandal. I always said there was something not quite right about that household. Too many secrets, you mark my words." Miss Marple poured tea and waited. Mrs. Hartnell was rarely short on opinions. That governess, Miss Pemberton, she only arrived 6 months ago. 6 months. And now the entire family dead and her alive to inherit, I shouldn't wonder. Inherit? Miss Marple's eyebrows rose delicately. Had Colonel Ashworth left her something in his will? Well, no, not that I know of, Mrs. Hartnell admitted, deflating slightly. But there must be something in it. Why else would she do such a thing? Why indeed, Miss Marple murmured. Dr. Haydock arrived next, his medical bag in hand, and his face grave. Now he accepted tea but waved away the offered biscuits. Nasty business, Jane, he said without preamble. I've just come from Greenways. Inspector Craddock wanted my opinion, though it's really a matter for the pathologist now. And what is your opinion, Doctor? Haydock frowned into his teacup. Arsenic, most likely. The symptoms fit. Violent illness, convulsions, rapid deterioration. But the odd thing is the timing. They all took ill around the same time, despite eating different amounts at different paces. Colonel Ashworth was a hearty eater. Mrs. Ashworth barely touched her food, according to the maid. Yet they all succumbed within hours of each other. How very curious, Miss Marple said. One might almost think the poison was administered in something they all consumed in equal measure, regardless of their appetite. My thoughts exactly. Water, perhaps, or wine. And the governess? She's in shock, naturally, pale as a ghost and trembling like a leaf. Claims she heard nothing unusual during the night. Her room is in the east wing, quite separate from the family quarters. By the time she came down for breakfast and found them, he shook his head. Poor woman. Whether she's guilty or innocent, she's had a terrible ordeal. By evening, Miss Marple had a clearer picture of the household at Greenways Manor, assembled from the various accounts brought to her door. It was a picture that troubled her considerably. Colonel Edmund Ashworth, aged 62, had been a man of rigid habits and firm opinions. His first wife had died in India 20 years ago, leaving him with 2 children. Gerald, though now 28 and something of a disappointment to his father, having failed at university and shown little inclination for any profession. And Millicent, 25, unmarried despite her father's efforts to secure her a suitable match. 3 years ago, the colonel had remarried. A woman named Lydia Winters, considerably younger than himself, who had been the daughter of one of his fellow officers. The marriage had not been entirely harmonious, according to village gossip. Lydia had expensive tastes and a fondness for London society that sat ill with her husband's more Spartan lifestyle. 6 months ago, Miss Clara Pemberton had joined the household as a companion governess to Millicent, an arrangement that had struck some as peculiar, given Millicent's age, and but which the colonel had apparently deemed necessary due to his daughter's delicate nerves. The household staff consisted of Mrs. Bridges, the cook, Daisy Foster, the housemaid, Robert Graves, the butler, and Tom Morrison, the gardener, who also served as handyman. All had been with the family since the colonel's arrival at Greenways, except for Daisy, who was a local girl hired just last year. As Miss Marple sat in her parlour that evening, the late spring twilight casting long shadows across her needlework, she found herself thinking about governesses. She had known quite a few in her long life. Some honest, some scheming, some desperately lonely, and some dangerously ambitious. There had been Miss Levington, who had stolen small items from her employers to supplement her meagre salary. There had been Miss Marsh, who had been wrongly accused of impropriety by a jealous mistress. And there had been Miss Partridge, who had quietly poisoned her elderly employer and inherited a small fortune, living quite comfortably for 5 years before her greed led her to try the same scheme again. Which sort of woman was Clara Pemberton? The telephone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Inspector Craddock calling from the police station in Much Benham. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Your nephew Raymond suggested I might consult with you on a rather delicate matter. The Greenways Manor case, Miss Marple inquired. You've heard, then? Of course you have. The whole county must know by now. He sighed heavily. Miss Marple. I've conducted dozens of murder investigations, but this one, there's something not quite right about it. Something I can't put my finger on." "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you might tell me exactly what happened, from the beginning." And so, as the evening deepened into night, Inspector Craddock recounted the events of that fatal Tuesday at Greenways Manor. As Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking steadily in her lap, she began to perceive the outlines of a puzzle far more complex and far more sinister than a simple case of poisoning for gain. The question was not merely who had killed the Ashworth family. The question was why only the governess had survived. The morning after Inspector Craddock's telephone call, Miss Marple found herself walking along the high street with what might have appeared to be aimless purpose. In truth, her route was calculated to intersect with several key points of village commerce: the post office, the butcher's shop, and most importantly, the bakery where Mrs. Bridges, the Greenways cook, had a sister who worked behind the counter. The bakery was doing a brisk trade, though Miss Marple suspected the customers were more interested in information than in bread. She joined the queue, noting the hushed, urgent quality of the conversations around her. "Unnatural, that's what it is," Mrs. Price from the tobacconist was saying. "A whole family wiped out in one night. It's like something from the Bible, a plague on the house." "Plague nothing," retorted Miss Cuthbert, the postmistress. "It's murder, plain and simple, and that governess is the only one who could have done it." "Stands to reason. Doesn't it?" Miss Marple reached the counter where Annie Bridges, Mrs. Bridges's younger sister, was wrapping loaves with hands that trembled slightly. "Good morning, Annie," Miss Marple said kindly. "I'll take one of your lovely cottage loaves, if you please. And how is your sister bearing up? This must be a terrible shock for her." Annie's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Miss Marple, she's beside herself. 30 years she's been in service, and never a breath of scandal. Now this! The police have questioned her 3 times already. 3 times, as if my sister would poison anyone." "I'm quite sure no one suspects your sister," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But she must have observed a great deal being in the household. The police naturally want her testimony." Annie leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "She told me something odd, Miss Marple. Something that don't make sense. That Tuesday, the day it happened, the Colonel changed his dinner plans at the last minute. They were supposed to have roast lamb, but he came into the kitchen around 4 o'clock and said he wanted duck instead. Duck, and my sister had to rush about, changing everything. How very inconvenient," Miss Marple murmured. "Did he give a reason?" "Said he'd had a letter that put him in mind of a meal he'd had in France years ago. Wanted to recreate it, he did. Very particular about the sauce, too. Had to be made with brandy and green peppercorns. Very specific he was." Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. A man who changed his dinner menu on a whim, or was it a whim, on the very day he was to be poisoned. How interesting. Her next stop was the draper's shop, where she found Mrs. Hartnell and Miss Weatherby engaged in animated conversation with the proprietor. The governess had only been there 6 months, Miss Weatherby was saying, her thin face alight with speculation. "But I heard, and this is from someone who knows, that the Colonel had changed his will just last month, made some new provisions." "For the governess?" Mrs. Hartnell gasped. "No one knows exactly. The solicitor, Mr. Petherick, is being very close-mouthed about it. But there's been changes, mark my words." Miss Marple selected a spool of thread she didn't particularly need and listened. "What about the son?" the draper asked. "Gerald Ashworth. I heard he was in debt. Gaming debts, they say." "Gambling." Mrs. Hartnell's voice rose with delicious horror. "Well, that gives him a motive, doesn't it? Like if his father threatened to cut him off?" "Except Gerald's dead too," Miss Weatherby pointed out with obvious disappointment. "Can't very well have killed himself along with the others, can he?" "Perhaps it was a suicide pact," Mrs. Hartnell suggested wildly. "The whole family, unable to bear some terrible shame." Including the Colonel, Miss Marple interjected gently. That does seem rather unlikely. Military men of his generation tend to face difficulties more directly, I found. By lunchtime, Miss Marple had collected a dozen different theories, each more improbable than the last. The Governess had been the Colonel's secret lover. The Governess had been blackmailing the family. The wife had discovered the Governess with her husband and poisoned everyone in a fit of jealous rage, then accidentally poisoned herself. And Gerald had killed his father for the inheritance, not realizing his stepmother and sister would also die. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully was not the theories themselves, but rather what they revealed about the Ashworth household. This was not a happy family. There had been tensions, resentments, secrets, the perfect breeding ground for violence. That afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Miss Clara Pemberton herself, accompanied by a constable who waited at the garden gate while the Governess walked up the path to Miss Marple's cottage. She was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 35, with a pale, refined face and dark hair pulled back severely. Her black dress was of good quality but several years out of fashion, and her hands, clasped tightly together, were red and work-worn. "Miss Marple?" Her voice was soft, educated, with a faint tremor beneath its surface. "Inspector Craddock suggested I might speak with you. He said you were understanding of difficult situations." "Do come in, my dear," Miss Marple said, noting the dark circles under the young woman's eyes in the way she held herself, as if bracing for a blow. "I think we might both benefit from a cup of tea." Miss Clara Pemberton sat in Miss Marple's parlor with the rigid posture of someone who had learned early in life that relaxation was a luxury she could not afford. She accepted the tea with trembling hands and took a small, careful sip before setting the cup down as though afraid she might break it. "I don't know why I came," she said quietly. "Inspector Craddock has been very kind, but I can see it in everyone's eyes. They think I did it. They think I poisoned the family." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked mildly, her knitting needles clicking softly. The directness of the question seemed to startle Miss Pemberton into a laugh that was half sob. No, of course not, but I can't prove it, can I? I was alone in my room all evening. No one saw me. I could have done anything." "You could have," Miss Marple agreed. "But the question isn't what you could have done, my dear. It's what you actually did. And more importantly, why someone else might have wanted the family dead." Miss Pemberton looked up sharply. "You believe someone else did this?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that 4 people dying at once from poisoning suggests either remarkable carelessness or very deliberate planning. You don't strike me as a careless person, as Miss Pemberton." "I'm not." The words came out fierce, almost defiant. "I've had to be careful all my life. After my father died, he was a clergyman, you see, in Dorset. There was no money. I've been a governess since I was 20. I've learned to be invisible, to cause no trouble, to keep my position. Poisoning my employers would be rather spectacularly contrary to that strategy, wouldn't it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I imagine it would. Tell me about the Ashworth family. What were they like?" Miss Pemberton's hands twisted in her lap. "Difficult. They were all difficult. The Colonel was a tyrant, really, though he'd have been shocked to hear himself described that way. He thought he was being a good father, a good husband, but everything had to be his way, his schedule, his rules, his decisions. And the others resented this. Gerald did. Constantly. He and his father argued about everything: money, Gerald's future, his friends. The Colonel wanted Gerald to go into the army, follow in his footsteps. Gerald wanted to be a writer or an artist or... She paused. I don't think Gerald knew what he wanted, except that it wasn't what his father wanted. And Miss Millicent. A shadow crossed Miss Pemberton's face. Millicent was complicated. On the surface, she was the dutiful daughter, but there was something else underneath. A kind of anger, I think. She'd been engaged twice, you see. and both times the colonel had interfered, decided the young men weren't suitable. The second time, I believe she truly cared for the man, a curate named Arthur Benson. The colonel sent him away, wrote to the bishop, and had him transferred to a parish in Scotland. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. That must have been very painful for Miss Millicent. She never forgave him. She was outwardly obedient, but I could see it in her eyes whenever she looked at her father. Pure hatred. And Mrs. Ashworth, the second Mrs. Ashworth. Miss Pemberton took another sip of tea, as though gathering strength. Lydia was miserable. She'd married the colonel thinking, well, I suppose thinking he had more money than he did, or that he'd be more generous with what he had. But he kept her on a very tight allowance. She couldn't go to London, couldn't buy new clothes, couldn't do any of the things she'd expected from marriage. She'd written to her sister in London 3 times asking if she might come for a visit. You see, the colonel refused each time. So we have, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. A household of 4 people, each of whom had reason to resent the colonel. Yet all 4 died. That's what makes no sense, Miss Pemberton said urgently. If someone wanted to kill the colonel, and heaven knows enough people might have wanted to, why kill the others? Why kill everyone? Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested gently, because the real target wasn't the colonel at all. Miss Pemberton stared at her. What do you mean? I mean that sometimes we make assumptions based on who seems most important. The colonel was the head of the household, so we assume he must have been the intended victim. But what if someone wanted to kill one of the others, and the rest had to die to disguise the real motive? But who would? Miss Pemberton stopped, on her face going even paler. Oh, God. You mean I'm the one who's supposed to look guilty because I survived? Someone killed them all and made sure I'd be blamed. It's a theory, Miss Marple said. Though I wonder, my dear, if you might help me understand one thing. Why were you really hired? A companion governess for a 25-year-old woman seems rather unusual, doesn't it? Miss Pemberton's hands stilled. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Millicent tried to kill herself last October. The colonel found her in the bath with her wrists cut. He covered it up, claimed she'd had an accident with a broken glass, but he knew he needed someone to watch her. Someone who could be trusted to be discreet. That's why he hired me. After Miss Pemberton had departed, escorted back to Greenways by the patient constable, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence for some time. The afternoon light slanted through her windows, casting elongated shadows across the carpet, and somewhere in the garden a thrush was singing with determined cheerfulness. She was thinking about patterns. In her experience, human nature followed certain predictable patterns, like the repeating motifs in a piece of knitting. One simply had to identify the pattern to understand where it would lead. There had been Mary Carter, the seamstress in the village, who had been found dead in her cottage 20 years ago. Everyone had assumed it was her ne'er-do-well brother who'd killed her for her savings. But Miss Marple had remembered another case, a landlady in Torquay who died in similar circumstances. In that case, the killer had been the seemingly devoted niece who'd actually been stealing from the old woman for years. The murder had been committed when discovery became imminent. Mary Carter, it turned out, had been about to notice discrepancies in her account books. Her trusted assistant, not her brother, had been the thief and murderer. The pattern wasn't the obvious suspect. The pattern was motive disguised as loyalty. What was the pattern here? Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Dr. Haydock stood on her doorstep, his expression grave. "Jane, might I have a word? It's rather urgent." She ushered him into the parlor, noting the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands gripped his medical bag. "The post-mortem results came back this afternoon," he said without preamble. "Inspector Craddock shared them with me given my initial examination of the bodies. Jane, it wasn't arsenic." Miss Marple's hands stilled on her knitting. "No, it was aconitine, monk's hood poisoning, a much more sophisticated choice than arsenic and considerably faster acting. The symptoms can mimic a heart attack or stroke in smaller doses, but in the amounts found in the Ashworth family, death would have been inevitable within hours of ingestion. "How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And where might one obtain aconitine?" "That's the curious thing. It's not something one can simply purchase at a chemist's shop. Monkshood grows wild in some gardens. The plant itself is quite beautiful, actually, with purple flowers. But extracting and concentrating the poison requires knowledge and preparation. Someone would need to know what they were doing, or have access to someone else's preparation," Miss Marple suggested. "You mentioned the Colonel kept various medicines from India. Might he have had anything of that nature?" Haydock frowned thoughtfully. "Possibly. Some of the old remedies from the East contained all sorts of alkaloids, but I'd need to examine his medicine cabinet to be certain. Inspector Craddock has sealed the house, of course, but I'm sure he'd permit me access in an official capacity." "I wonder," Miss Marple said carefully, "whether you might mention to the inspector that monkshood also grows in England, in gardens, perhaps even in the garden at Greenways Manor itself. You think someone cultivated it deliberately? I think it would be worth investigating. Tom Morrison is the gardener there, isn't he? He'd know what grows on the estate." After Dr. Haydock had departed with a promise to pursue this line of inquiry, Miss Marple found herself with another visitor. This time it was Daisy Foster, the housemaid from Greenways, her eyes red from crying and her hands twisting nervously at her apron. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Annie Bridges said you were asking questions about the house, and I thought I ought to tell someone what I saw. Do sit down, Daisy. You look quite worn out." The girl perched on the edge of the chair as though ready to bolt at any moment. "It's about that Tuesday, miss. The day they died. Man, I saw something that didn't seem right at the time, but I didn't think nothing of it until now." "What did you see?" "It was in the afternoon, around 3:30. I was upstairs turning down the beds. We always did them early on Tuesdays, because Mrs. Bridges needed help with the dinner preparations. I was in Mr. Gerald's room, and I looked out the window and saw Miss Millicent in the garden. She was by the old potting shed, the one we don't use much anymore, and she was digging something up." "Digging?" "Yes, miss. With a trowel. She dug up something. I couldn't see what from that distance, and put it in her pocket. Then she looked around, all furtive-like, as if checking no one was watching. But she didn't look up, you see. Didn't think to check the windows." Miss Marple's mind was racing. "Did you mention this to Inspector Craddock?" "No, miss. I didn't think it mattered. Miss Millicent's dead too, isn't she? So what she was doing couldn't have anything to do with the poisoning, could it?" "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Or perhaps it has everything to do with it. Tell me, Daisy, this potting shed, what's kept there?" "Old tools, mostly. Broken flower pots. Tom Morrison says it's full of rubbish that ought to be cleared out. But there's plants there too, ones that Mrs. Fortescue, the old owner, used to grow. Tom says some of them are poisonous, but they're pretty, so he leaves them be." "Monkshood, perhaps?" Daisy's eyes widened. "I don't know the names, miss, but there's purple flowers there. Tall ones, and Tom warned me never to touch them without gloves." After Daisy had left, considerably lighter in spirit after unburdening herself, Miss Marple sat back in her chair and closed her eyes. The pattern was beginning to emerge now, like a photograph developing in a chemical bath. But it was a pattern that disturbed her greatly because it suggested something far more tragic than simple greed or revenge. It suggested desperation. And desperate people, in Miss Marple's long experience, were capable of the most terrible things. That evening, Miss Marple did something she rarely did. She telephoned Inspector Craddock at his hotel and requested a meeting at Greenways Manor itself. The inspector, perhaps recognizing the urgency in her usually placid voice, agreed immediately and sent a car to collect her within the hour. And the drive through the darkening countryside gave Miss Marple time to arrange her thoughts. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though there were still gaps. Significant gaps that troubled her. She thought again of the case of Emily Skinner, who had attempted to poison her entire family but had succeeded only in killing her sister. The investigation had revealed that Emily had meant to kill only the sister all along. The threat to the others had been mere theater, designed to deflect suspicion. Was that the pattern here? Had someone meant to kill only one person, with the others serving as camouflage? Greenway's Manor loomed against the twilight sky, its windows dark except for a few rooms where the police had established their temporary headquarters. Inspector Craddock met her at the door, to his lean face showing the strain of the investigation. "Miss Marple, thank you for coming. Dr. Haydock mentioned you had some thoughts about the garden. He's already inside. We've been examining the potting shed." "And what did you find?" "Monkshood, as you suspected. A considerable patch of it, actually, growing wild near the back of the shed. Someone had recently harvested some. The stems were freshly cut." He led her through the house, past the sealed dining room where the family had taken their last meal. "But that's not all. We found something else in Miss Millicent's room." He brought her to a bedroom on the first floor, a lady's room decorated in pale blues and whites with watercolors of pastoral scenes on the walls. On the dressing table, marked with an evidence tag, sat a small glass vial containing a dark liquid. "We found it hidden in her jewelry box," Craddock said. "Preliminary analysis suggests it's a tincture of aconite. Monkshood poison, concentrated and prepared for use, enough to kill a dozen people." Miss Marple examined the vial without touching it. "Did you find any notes, any indication of what she intended to do with it?" "Nothing. But the implication is clear, isn't it? Miss Millicent prepared the poison. Miss Millicent had motive. Her father had ruined her life, interfered with her engagements, kept her trapped in this house. She poisoned the dinner, planning to kill them all. But something went wrong. She died along with her intended victims." "A murder-suicide," Miss Marple said slowly. "That's your theory? Can you suggest another explanation?" Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her sharp eyes moving around the room, and taking in details that spoke of the woman who had lived here. The books on the nightstand, romantic novels, poetry, a volume of Shakespeare's tragedies. The needlework in the basket by the chair, depicting a cottage garden in summer. The photograph on the mantelpiece of a young man in clerical dress, Arthur Benson, presumably, the curate who had been sent away. "Inspector," she said finally, "when you investigated Miss Millicent's previous suicide attempt, what method did she use?" "She cut her wrists in the bath. Her father found her in time." "Precisely. A direct method. Immediate. The act of someone in the grip of despair who wanted to end her own suffering." Miss Marple turned to face him. "Does it strike you as consistent that the same woman would then prepare a sophisticated poison, administer it to her entire family at dinner, and then calmly sit down to die with them?" "Suicide by poison is often a solitary act, Inspector. One takes it alone, in private. One doesn't share the experience with others unless one is trying to disguise a murder as a group tragedy," Craddock finished, his expression sharpening. "You think someone else prepared the poison and planted it in her room to make it look like she was the killer?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we should consider all possibilities. Tell me, has anyone examined the actual food from that dinner? What remains of it?" "Mrs. Bridges kept the leftovers in the larder, per our instructions. We've tested everything. The duck, the vegetables, the sauce, even the bread. Nothing showed traces of poison." "And the beverages?" "The wine bottle was empty. They'd consumed it all. We tested the dregs. Nothing. Same with the water carafe." Miss Marple frowned. This was the central puzzle. 4 people poisoned at dinner, yet no poison in the food or drink. How had the aconitine been administered? "Might I see the dining room?" she asked. Craddock led her down the hallway to a formal room dominated by a long mahogany table, still set as it had been that fatal evening. The police had preserved the scene meticulously. 4 place settings remained, the plates and the cutlery exactly as they'd been left when the diners had risen in distress. Miss Marple moved slowly around the table, examining each setting. The Colonel's place at the head, Mrs. Ashworth to his right, Gerald and Millicent facing each other across the middle of the table. At each place setting sat a small decorative item she hadn't expected to see, a delicate porcelain finger bowl, and the kind used for rinsing one's fingers after a meal. "Inspector," she said quietly, "did anyone test these?" Craddock looked puzzled. "The finger bowls? No, we didn't think. They'd have been filled with clean water, surely. Just for washing hands." "Filled with water," Miss Marple agreed, "and used by everyone at the table, regardless of how much they'd eaten or drunk. Each person would have dipped their fingers in the water, then perhaps touched their lips, their faces. The poison would be absorbed through the skin and mucous membranes, and afterwards the water would be discarded, the bowls washed by the maid, all evidence destroyed." Craddock stared at the finger bowls with dawning horror. "Good God, you're right, but it means the person who filled these bowls with poisoned water is our murderer," Miss Marple said. "Aye, and I think we both know who that must have been." The realization settled over the dining room like a chill. Inspector Craddock moved to the servant's bell pull, his face grim with understanding. "Robert Graves," he said, "the butler. He would have prepared the finger bowls before service, placed them at each setting. He had the opportunity and the access." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And if I'm not mistaken, he also had a motive. Mrs. Ashworth's alleged affair, if it was indeed with Graves, might have provided the emotional impetus. But there's something else, Inspector, something that's been troubling me since Miss Pemberton mentioned it." "The letter? The one that arrived Tuesday morning and put the Colonel in such a temper?" "Precisely. I wonder if we might locate that letter. And it seems to have set off a chain of events. The changed dinner menu, the argument with Mrs. Ashworth about money, her threat regarding Inspector Markham and the real reason they left India. I suspect that letter is rather important." Craddock led her to the Colonel's study, a masculine room lined with books and hunting trophies from his years in India. The desk had already been searched by police, its contents catalogued and sorted. Among the papers, Craddock produced a letter dated the previous Monday, postmarked from London. Miss Marple read it carefully, her expression growing more grave with each line. The letter was from a private inquiry agent named Michaels, and it concerned Gerald Ashworth. The young man had not merely accumulated gambling debts. He had been involved in a forgery scheme, passing fraudulent checks in his father's name. The matter had been hushed up by the victims in exchange for restitution, but Michaels had uncovered the truth. He was writing to inform the Colonel that Gerald's debts now totaled nearly £3,000, a substantial sum, and that several creditors were threatening legal action. "So Gerald was in desperate financial straits," Craddock said. "That certainly gives him motive to kill his father, but Gerald died too." "Unless," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "Gerald didn't know the poison was in the finger bowls. Unless he thought he was poisoning only his father through some other means, and someone else, someone who knew what Gerald was planning, used a different method that killed them all." She paused, setting down the letter. "But that seems unnecessarily complicated, doesn't it? Yes, and it doesn't explain why the vial of poison was hidden in Millicent's room, or why she was seen digging up monkshood from the garden. Perhaps she was gathering it for her brother. Perhaps they were working together. Perhaps." But Miss Marple sounded unconvinced. She turned to examine a photograph on the Colonel's desk, a faded image of a younger Edmund Ashworth in military dress, standing before what appeared to be a colonial administrative building. Beside him stood another officer and a stern-looking woman in Victorian dress. "Who are these people?" she asked. Craddock consulted his notes. "The other officer is Major Winters." Lydia Ashworth's father. He served under the colonel in India. The woman is unidentified, but presumably someone connected to the regiment. Miss Marple studied the photograph intently. There was something about it nagged at her memory, some connection she couldn't quite grasp. She thought of Miss Pemberton's words. Perhaps I should tell Inspector Markham about the real reason we left India. Inspector, I wonder if you might make an inquiry with the India office in London. Ask about Colonel Ashworth's service record, particularly the circumstances of his retirement 3 years ago, and ask specifically if there was ever an Inspector Markham involved in any investigation concerning the colonel or his regiment. You think there was a scandal? I think Mrs. Ashworth knew something important enough to use as leverage against her husband. And people don't typically threaten to expose scandals unless they're desperate. A constable appeared at the study door. Begging pardon, sir, but Robert Graves has just returned to the house. He's been staying with his sister in the village since the incident. Says he's come to collect some personal belongings. Has he indeed? Craddock's expression sharpened. Miss Marple, would you care to observe while I question him? They found Graves in the servants' hall, a tall man in his early 40s with graying hair and the impassive expression characteristic of his profession. He rose respectfully when they entered, but Miss Marple noticed the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes darted toward the door. Mr. Graves, Craddock began, I have a few additional questions about the evening of the murders. You served dinner that night, did you not? I did, sir, as always. And you prepared the table, set out the plates, the cutlery. Was the finger bowls? The slightest hesitation. Yes, sir. Where did you obtain the water for the finger bowls? From the kitchen, sir. Fresh water from the tap, with a slice of lemon in each bowl. Mrs. Ashworth preferred it that way. And you filled them yourself? I did. Graves' voice remained steady, but a fine sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead. Is there some problem with that? The problem, Mr. Graves, is that those finger bowls contained the poison that killed the family, and you were the only person who handled them. The butler's composure cracked. No, that's impossible. I filled them with plain water, I swear it. I would never, Mrs. Ashworth and I. He stopped abruptly, realizing what he'd almost revealed. You and Mrs. Ashworth were having an affair, Craddock said flatly. We know about that. And what we need to know is whether you killed her husband and why the others had to die as well. Graves sank into a chair, his face ashen. I loved her. God help me. I loved her. But I never poisoned anyone. I swear on my life, Inspector. Those finger bowls were filled with ordinary water. Miss Marple, watching him carefully, believed him, which meant the pattern she'd been piecing together was still incomplete. Someone else had added poison to those bowls. But who? And when? The question hung in the servants' hall like an accusation. Robert Graves sat with his head in his hands, the perfect composure of the professional servant completely shattered. Inspector Craddock paced the small room, frustration evident in every movement. Miss Marple remained still, her hands folded in her lap, her mind working through the sequence of events. If Graves had filled the finger bowls with clean water, then someone else must have contaminated them before the meal was served. But who had access? Who could have done so without being observed? Mr. Graves, she said gently, after you prepared the finger bowls, what did you do? He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. I set them on the table, as I said. Then I returned to the kitchen to assist Mrs. Bridges with plating the duck. The colonel had changed the menu at the last moment, and everything was running behind schedule. How long were you in the kitchen? Perhaps 15 minutes, maybe 20. We were short-handed. Daisy was upstairs, still finishing the bedrooms. So the dining room was unattended for 20 minutes, Craddock said. So anyone could have entered and tampered with the finger bowls. But who would have known to do so? Miss Marple asked. The finger bowls were an unusual touch, not something used at every meal, I imagine. Someone would need to know they'd be there and to have the poison prepared and ready. This wasn't a spontaneous act. Graves nodded slowly. Mrs. Ashworth requested them specifically that day, in the morning after the colonel received his letter. She came to me in the butler's pantry and said we'd be using the formal service that evening, including the finger bowls. She seemed— He paused, searching for the word. Determined, as if she'd made some important decision. Did she say why? No, miss, but she'd been agitated all morning. I heard her arguing with the colonel, as Miss Pemberton told you. She was threatening him with something, some secret from India. The colonel was terrified. I'd never seen him like that before. A man who'd faced down armed rebellions, reduced to a trembling wreck by whatever Lydia knew. Miss Marple leaned forward. Mr. Graves, did Mrs. Ashworth ever speak to you about India? About her father, Major Winters, or about anything unusual that happened there? Only once. Graves' voice dropped to barely above a whisper. It was about a month ago. We were alone in the library one afternoon. She'd been drinking, which she did more and more lately. She said her father had been murdered. Not killed in battle, as everyone believed, but murdered. And she said Edmund, the colonel, knew who'd done it but had covered it up to protect the regiment's reputation. The room went very quiet. Outside, and a clock chimed the hour, each note falling into the silence like a stone into still water. Did she say who the murderer was? Craddock asked urgently. No. She said she didn't have proof, not yet. But she was searching for it. She said there were records, documents that would expose everything. She said when she found them, she'd make Edmund pay for what he'd done, for protecting a killer and letting her father's death go unavenged. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The pattern was becoming clearer now, but it was a darker pattern than she'd anticipated. And did she find these documents? I don't know, but last week she seemed different, triumphant almost. She told me to be patient, that soon everything would change. She said she was going to confront Edmund with the evidence, for he'd have no choice but to give her what she wanted. Money, Craddock said. She was blackmailing her own husband. For our future, Graves said desperately. She was going to leave him. Once she had enough money, we were going to go away together. Start a new life. She promised me. Miss Marple felt a deep sadness settle over her. She'd seen this pattern before, too. The desperate lover, the promised escape that would never come. There had been James Fletcher, the gardener who'd believed his employer's wife would run away with him. There had been William Bates, who'd been promised marriage by a woman who had no intention of leaving her comfortable life. In both cases, the men had been used and then discarded when they were no longer useful. Mr. Graves, she said quietly, where were you when you learned that Mrs. Ashworth had requested the formal service with finger bowls? I was in my pantry, as I said. Lydia came to me there around 10 in the morning. And who else might have overheard this conversation? Graves frowned, thinking. The pantry door was ajar. Daisy was in the hallway polishing the brass. She might have heard, and— He stopped, his face paling further. And Miss Pemberton. She came down the stairs just as Lydia was leaving. They nearly collided. Miss Pemberton apologized and went into the drawing room. So Miss Pemberton would have known about the finger bowls, Craddock said grimly. She would have known they'd be on the table that evening. But Miss Marple was shaking her head. Miss Pemberton was in her room with a migraine by 4 o'clock. The finger bowls wouldn't have been set out until just before dinner at 7. She couldn't have poisoned them. Unless, Craddock said slowly, she poisoned them earlier, and they were simply placed on the table as prepared. Miss Marple considered this. Mr. Graves, who actually handled the finger bowls between the time you prepared them and the time they were placed on the table. Graves' face went white. No one. I prepared them myself and set them directly at each place, unless— He stopped, horror dawning in his eyes. Dear God. The lemon slices. What about them? I didn't cut them. Daisy did. She prepared them in the kitchen and brought them to me on a plate. I placed 1 slice in each bowl. If the poison was on the lemon slices, "Then Daisy Foster is our murderer," Craddock finished. The pronouncement seemed almost anticlimactic. Daisy Foster, the young housemaid who had wept in Miss Marple's parlour, and who had seemed so anxious to unburden herself about seeing Millicent digging in the garden, was a poisoner who had killed 4 people in cold blood. And yet something about it troubled Miss Marple deeply. "Inspector," she said carefully, "before we proceed, might we consider motive? What possible reason would a young housemaid have for killing the entire Ashworth family? Money, perhaps. Theft. Maybe she'd been caught stealing and was about to be dismissed. Then why not simply leave? Why commit murder on such a scale?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, there's something we're missing. Something important." But Craddock was already in motion, sending constables to locate Daisy Foster and bring her in for questioning. Miss Marple remained in the servants' hall with Robert Graves, who sat slumped in his chair, on his world collapsing around him. "Mr. Graves," she said gently, "tell me about Daisy. How long has she been with the household?" "Just over a year. She came from the village. Her mother is the seamstress on the high street. A quiet girl, efficient. I had no complaints about her work." "Did she have any particular relationships with the family members? Any conflicts?" Graves considered this. She was somewhat afraid of the colonel. Most of the staff were. He had a temper, but she got on well enough with Mrs. Ashworth and Miss Millicent. Mr. Gerald flirted with her occasionally, but nothing serious. Just his way. And with Miss Pemberton? Daisy seemed to admire her, asked her advice about books to read, that sort of thing. Miss Pemberton was kind to her, I think, treated her as more than just a servant. Miss Marple filed this away. Yes, the pieces were shifting again, forming a new pattern. She thought of what Daisy had told her about seeing Millicent digging up something from the garden. Had Daisy been trying to implicate the dead woman? Or had she been telling the truth, and someone else had made use of what Millicent had gathered? The constable returned 20 minutes later with troubling news. Daisy Foster was not at her mother's house in the village. Her mother claimed she hadn't seen her daughter since that morning when Daisy had said she was going to Greenways to speak with the police. But she'd never arrived. "She's run," Craddock said grimly. "Guilty conscience. We'll find her, though. She can't have gone far." But Miss Marple was thinking of something else entirely. She was thinking of the vial of poison found in Millicent's room, thus in the convenient way Daisy had mentioned seeing Millicent in the garden. She was thinking of how carefully someone had arranged the evidence to point away from themselves. "Inspector," she said urgently, "I don't believe Daisy has run. I believe she's in danger." Danger? From whom? From whoever actually committed these murders. Someone who's been very clever, very patient, and who's been misdirecting us from the beginning. Miss Marple rose to her feet with sudden decisiveness. "We need to search the grounds, particularly the old potting shed where Millicent was seen digging." The search party assembled quickly. Craddock, 2 constables, Tom Morrison the gardener, and Miss Marple herself, who refused to be left behind despite the inspector's protests. They made their way through the darkening grounds of Greenways, their lanterns casting wild shadows across the overgrown paths. The potting shed stood at the far end of the garden, a dilapidated structure half hidden by brambles. Tom Morrison produced a key, but the door was already ajar, hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. Broken pots littered the floor, and old tools hung on the walls like instruments of torture. At the back of the shed, partially concealed by burlap sacking, was a wooden chest. "That wasn't there before," Morrison said, frowning. "Or at least, I've never noticed it." Craddock lifted the sacking carefully. The chest was old but sturdy, with a simple clasp lock that had been recently forced open. Inside were papers, official documents with the stamp of the Indian Colonial Administration, letters in faded ink, and a leather-bound journal. Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the journal. The name on the file plate was unmistakable. Major Richard Winters. Lydia's father, Craddock breathed. These are his private papers. This must be the evidence she was searching for. Miss Marple began to read, her face growing paler with each page. The journal detailed Major Winters' final months in India, his growing suspicions about corruption within the regiment, his investigation into missing funds and falsified records, and his confrontation with the officer he believed responsible. The officer's name appeared again and again in the increasingly frantic entries. Colonel Edmund Ashworth. The final entry was dated 3 days before Major Winters' death. In it, he wrote that he had confronted Ashworth with the evidence and given him 24 hours to confess. He wrote that he feared for his safety, that Ashworth had looked at him with murder in his eyes. The next page had been torn out, but the implication was clear enough. Ashworth killed Major Winters to cover up his embezzlement, Craddock said. Made it look like an accident in the field, and when Lydia discovered the truth, she used it to blackmail him. Yes, Miss Marple said softly, but there's something else here. Something we've all overlooked. She turned to a page near the end of the journal where a photograph had been pressed between the pages. It showed Major Winters with a young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, sitting on his knee. On the back was written, "My darling daughters, Lydia and Clara, June 1885, and the silence that followed was absolute. Clara, Craddock whispered. Clara Pemberton. She's not just the governess. She's Lydia's sister, Major Winters' daughter. And suddenly, Miss Marple understood everything. The revelation restructured everything they thought they knew, like a kaleidoscope shifting to reveal an entirely different pattern. Miss Marple stood in the dusty potting shed, the journal still in her hands, and felt the familiar sadness that always accompanied the unmasking of a murderer, driven by grief and rage. "Sisters," she said quietly. Lydia and Clara were sisters, Major Winters' daughters, which means Clara Pemberton had just as much reason as Lydia to want revenge on Colonel Ashworth. "More reason, perhaps," Craddock said, his voice tight. Lydia at least had married the man, benefited from his position and wealth. But Clara, Miss Pemberton told you herself she'd been a governess since she was 20, living on the charity of strangers, moving from household to household, all because her father's death left her penniless. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And when Lydia discovered the truth about their father's murder, that Edmund Ashworth had killed him to cover up his theft of regimental funds, she must have contacted her sister. They would have planned together. Lydia would use the evidence to blackmail her husband, extract as much money as possible, and then Clara would kill him. Craddock finished. But why kill Lydia too? Why kill all of them? Miss Marple turned to examine the chest more carefully. Beneath the journal and her papers was something else, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. She lifted them out, noting the recent postmarks, the letters between two sisters, planning murder. She read one aloud, dated 3 months earlier. "Dearest Clara, I have found Father's journal at last. It was in the attic, hidden in an old trunk of his military effects. You were right. Edmund did kill him. The proof is here in Father's own hand. We will make him pay for what he took from us. Come to Greenways. I will arrange a position for you as Millicent's companion. No one must suspect we are sisters." Another, from just 2 weeks ago. "Clara, I've confronted Edmund with the evidence. He is terrified, as well he should be. He has agreed to give me £5,000. Our inheritance, our due. I will tell him I'm leaving him, going to London. You and I will share the money and finally have the lives we should have had. But we must be careful. Edmund is desperate. I fear what he might do." And then, the final letter, dated the Monday before the murders. "Sister, I have made a terrible mistake. Edmund knows about you. He discovered our correspondence. He says if I do not return Father's journal and all the evidence, He will expose us both. He will claim we have been conspiring to blackmail him. We will be arrested, imprisoned. I am so frightened. We must act now before he can move against us. You know what must be done. For father, for us, for justice." "So they decided to kill him," Craddock said. Clara prepared the poison from the monk's hood in the garden. She had the knowledge, being educated and well-read. Lydia arranged for the formal dinner with the finger bowls, knowing Clara could contaminate them. But something went wrong. "Nothing went wrong," Miss Marple said, and a terrible certainty settling over her. "Everything went exactly as Clara Pemberton planned. Don't you see? Lydia wanted money. She wanted to blackmail her husband and escape to a better life. But Clara wanted something else entirely. Clara wanted revenge." The constable, who had been standing guard at the shed door, suddenly called out, "Sir, there's someone coming! A woman!" They emerged from the shed to see a figure approaching through the garden, moving slowly, almost dreamlike, in the lantern light. Clara Pemberton walked toward them with the measured tread of someone who had reached the end of a long journey. In her hand was a small revolver, antique but, Miss Marple suspected, quite functional. "Miss Pemberton," Craddock said carefully, his hand moving toward his own weapon, "please put down the gun." "I don't intend to shoot anyone." "Not Inspector," Clara said calmly. "This was my father's service revolver. I thought I might use it on myself, but I find I lack the courage. I've lacked courage all my life, you see. Until now." "Where is Daisy Foster?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Clara's composure flickered for just a moment. "Safe. Locked in the wine cellar. I couldn't have her running to you too soon, you see. I needed time to finish what I'd started. Time to retrieve my father's journal before you found it." She looked at the chest in Craddock's hands and smiled sadly. "But I'm too late, aren't I? You've read everything. You know what Edmund Ashworth was. A thief and a murderer. And you became a murderer yourself," Miss Marple said. "But not just of Colonel Ashworth. You killed your own sister, Clara. You killed Lydia." "She would have settled for money," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Can you imagine? Our father murdered, his reputation destroyed, our lives ruined, and Lydia would have taken £5,000 and called it justice. She would have let Edmund Ashworth live, let him keep his comfortable retirement, his reputation. She would have betrayed everything father stood for." "So you planned to kill them all from the beginning," Craddock said. "You let your sister think you were helping her blackmail the colonel, but you were planning murder." Clara nodded. "I told Lydia I would put the poison only in Edmund's finger bowl. She believed me. She thought Gerald and Millicent would be unharmed, that only her husband would die. She even requested the formal service, as I'd suggested, thinking she was helping execute our plan. But I poisoned all 4 bowls. I wanted to destroy everything Edmund Ashworth had built. His family, his legacy, everything." "And you hid the vial in Millicent's room," Miss Marple said. "Planted evidence to suggest she was the killer." "I needed suspicion to fall on someone other than myself," Clara admitted. Millicent seemed the logical choice, her suicide attempt, her hatred of her father. And when that dim-witted girl Daisy saw Millicent digging in the garden, it was perfect. I encouraged Daisy to tell you, knowing it would further implicate the dead. She looked at them all with eyes that held no regret, only a terrible, cold satisfaction. My father was a good man, an honorable man, and Edmund Ashworth murdered him and stole everything from us. Tell me, Miss Marple, what would you have done?" Miss Marple met Clara Pemberton's gaze steadily, seeing in those dark eyes the same terrible certainty she had seen before in other murderers who believed their cause justified their crimes. There had been Grace Bedingfield, who had poisoned her sister's husband for ruining the family. There had been Thomas Eade, who had killed his business partner for betraying their friendship. All of them had believed themselves righteous, all of them had been wrong. I would have sought justice through the law, Miss Marple said quietly. I would have presented the evidence, your father's journal, the documents proving Colonel Ashworth's embezzlement. The truth would have come out. The colonel would have faced trial, imprisonment, disgrace. His reputation would have been destroyed far more thoroughly than by a quick death. The law? Clara laughed bitterly. The law that protected him for 20 years. The law that accepted his lies about my father's death. The military protects its own, Miss Marple. There would have been no trial. The evidence would have been suppressed, and Lydia and I would have been painted as vindictive women making false accusations against a decorated officer. Perhaps, Miss Marple acknowledged. Or perhaps not. We'll never know now, will we? Because you chose murder instead. And in doing so, you killed 3 innocent people along with your enemy. Innocent? Clara's voice rose. Gerald was a forger and a wastrel, living off his father's stolen money. Millicent was so consumed by her own misery, she couldn't see anyone else's suffering. And Lydia, her voice broke. Lydia chose comfort over justice. She chose to become Ashworth's wife, to live in his house, and to bear his name. She betrayed our father's memory every day she stayed with him. She was trying to gather evidence, Craddock interjected. According to these letters, she spent months searching for your father's journal. She confronted Ashworth. She was trying to profit, Clara interrupted. That's all it was to her. An opportunity to extract money from a bad situation. She didn't want justice. She wanted comfort. She wanted to go to London and live well and forget that our father died in shame and poverty. Miss Marple studied the younger woman's face, seeing the years of bitterness and resentment that had accumulated like poison in her soul. When did you decide to kill her? When did you realize your sister would have to die along with the others? Clara was silent for a long moment, but the revolver dangling loosely in her hand. The moment she showed me the letter from Edmund agreeing to pay her £5,000. She was so happy, so relieved. She said we could start over, that we'd finally have security. And I looked at her and realized she'd forgotten what it was about. She'd forgotten father. She'd made it about money, about her own comfort, just like Edmund Ashworth had, putting money before honor, before justice, before everything. So you decided she deserved to die as well. I decided she was already lost to me, the sister I'd loved, the girl who'd cried with me when father died. She was gone. What remained was just another person who'd been corrupted by Edmund Ashworth. Clara's hand tightened on the revolver. I told myself I was freeing her, that she'd want to die rather than live knowing she'd betrayed father's memory for money. But you didn't give her that choice, Miss Marple said, just as you didn't give Gerald or Millicent any choice. You appointed yourself judge, jury, and executioner. Someone had to. Clara's voice was flat now, drained of emotion. Someone had to make them pay. Inspector Craddock moved closer, his hand extended. Miss Pemberton, please give me the weapon. It's over now. Let us take you in. You'll have a trial, a chance to tell your story, to present the evidence of what Colonel Ashworth did. A trial where I'll be hanged for murder, Clara said simply. Because that's what I am, isn't it? A murderer, not a soldier in battle, not an executioner carrying out a lawful sentence, just a poisoner. And a woman who killed her own sister. She looked down at the revolver in her hand. My father carried this in 3 campaigns. He was mentioned in dispatches twice for bravery. He saved men's lives. And I've used his legacy to take lives. What would he think of me, do you suppose? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that he would have wanted you to live, to find happiness, to make a life for yourself, not to destroy yourself seeking revenge for his death. Then you didn't know my father. Clara raised the revolver, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she might actually use it, but instead she reversed it and held it out to Craddock. Grip first. He taught us that honor was worth more than life, that justice mattered more than comfort. I've lived by those principles, Inspector. I've failed by them, perhaps. But I've lived by them. Craddock took the weapon carefully and nodded to his constables. As they stepped forward to take Clara into custody, she turned to Miss Marple one last time. "Tell me honestly, do you think I'm mad? Do you think this was all the delusion of an unbalanced mind?" Miss Marple considered the question carefully. "I think you're a woman who loved her father very much and was broken by his death and the injustice that followed it. I think you spent 20 years nursing that wound, letting it poison you from within. I don't know if that's madness, Miss Pemberton, but I know it's tragedy." Clara nodded slowly, as if this answer satisfied her. "Yes, tragedy. That's the right word for it. A tragedy where no one survives except the governess." The April rain had come to St. Mary Mead, and washing the village clean with that particular English persistence that could turn a pleasant spring afternoon into a study in grey. Miss Marple sat in her parlour 3 weeks after Clara Pemberton's arrest, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm while the rain drummed against the windows. The trial was set for the summer assizes. Clara had confessed everything: the preparation of the poison, the careful timing, the deliberate contamination of the lemon slices that Daisy Foster had innocently delivered to Robert Graves for the finger bowls. She had explained how she'd stolen Millicent's key to access her room and plant the vial of remaining poison. She had described, in chilling detail, how she'd watched Millicent digging up monkshood from the garden and had encouraged that activity, to knowing it would provide evidence against the dead woman. What Clara had not explained, what Miss Marple suspected she could not explain even to herself, was the exact moment when grief had curdled into hatred, when justice had transformed into vengeance, when love for her father had become permission to commit the unforgivable. Dr. Haydock had visited that morning, bringing news from Much Benham, where he'd attended a consultation. "They're saying Clara Pemberton will plead guilty but insane," he told Miss Marple over tea. "Her solicitor believes he can argue that years of privation and grief had unbalanced her mind. They'll push for Broadmoor rather than the gallows." "And what do you think?" Miss Marple had asked. "I think," Haydock said carefully, "that she knew exactly what she was doing. She planned it meticulously, had executed it flawlessly, and felt no remorse until she was caught. That's not insanity in any medical sense, I recognize, but it may be madness of another kind, the madness that comes from living too long with a single fixed idea." Now, in the rainy afternoon quiet, Miss Marple reflected on the casualties of the case: 4 dead by poison, 1 woman awaiting trial for murder. Robert Graves had left the district, unable to bear the scandal and the loss of the woman he'd loved. Daisy Foster, traumatized by her imprisonment in the wine cellar and her unwitting role in the murders, had given notice and returned to her mother's house, refusing to enter service again. The Greenways estate had been sealed pending settlement of the Colonel's affairs. It turned out there was very little money. Much of the wealth people had assumed Edmund Ashworth possessed had been illusion, maintained by careful management and rigid economy. The India Office investigation, prompted by the discovery of Major Winter's journal, had uncovered the embezzlement, but found that most of the stolen funds had been lost decades ago in bad investments. There would be no inheritance for anyone, no restitution for the Winters sisters. It was all so pointless, Miss Marple thought. All that death, all that suffering, and for what? Edmund Ashworth had already been suffering, trapped in a loveless marriage, estranged from his children, living in fear of exposure. A few more years and age or illness would have claimed him anyway, but Clara couldn't wait for time to deliver its inevitable justice. She had needed to act, or to strike, to prove that she hadn't forgotten or forgiven. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Joan appeared a moment later, shaking rain from her umbrella and bringing with her the scent of wet wool and fresh air. "Aunt Jane, I've just come from the village. Everyone's talking about the trial, of course. Mrs. Hartnell is convinced Clara Pemberton should hang. Miss Weatherby says she's the victim of male oppression and should be pardoned. The whole village is divided." "And what do you think, my dear?" Miss Marple asked. pouring fresh tea. Joan settled into her chair, frowning thoughtfully. I think she did a terrible thing, but I also think, well, if someone had murdered my father and gotten away with it for 20 years, if I'd been forced into poverty and servitude because of it, might I not want revenge too? Does that make me wicked? It makes you human, Miss Marple said. We all have dark impulses, dear. The difference between us and Clara Pemberton is that most of us don't act on them. We choose, every day, to live within the boundaries of civilization, even when we're angry or hurt or convinced that we've been treated unjustly. But those boundaries failed her, didn't they? Failed her father first, by letting his murderer go free. Perhaps they did. Human institutions are imperfect, the law, the military, society itself. They fail people constantly. But when we take justice into our own hands, when we decide that our pain justifies any action, we don't correct those failures. We simply add to them. We become the very thing we're fighting against. Joan was silent for a moment, watching the rain streak down the windows. Now, do you think she regrets it? Really regrets it? Not just regrets being caught? Miss Marple considered the question. She thought of Clara's face in the garden at Greenways, of the cold satisfaction in her eyes when she described destroying everything Edmund Ashworth had built. She thought of how Clara had asked if she was mad, as if madness might absolve her of responsibility. I think, she said slowly, that Clara Pemberton regrets the necessity of it. She wishes the world were different, that her father hadn't been murdered, that she hadn't been driven to such desperate measures. But the act itself? The murders? No, I don't think she regrets those. She believes she was right, you see. And that, perhaps, is the saddest part of all. The rain continued through the afternoon, washing the streets of St. Mary Mead, and running in rivulets through the gardens where spring flowers bowed under the weight of water. At Greenways Manor, the empty house stood silent, its windows dark, its rooms holding the secrets of that final dinner when 4 people had washed their hands in poisoned water and sealed their fates. In her cell in Much Benham, Clara Pemberton sat on her narrow bed and read her father's journal for what must have been the 100th time, tracing his words with her finger, finding comfort in his voice speaking across the decades. She had avenged him. She had made them all pay. She told herself it had been worth it. She told herself this every day. Sometimes, late at night, she almost believed it.